Why not? Okay, everybody, hi. So funny about yesterday. Sorry, I literally was just talking to myself for 10 minutes before I realized that nobody was here. I just wanted to wrap up a few things before Jen and I send you off into this kind of pairing lab. So I'll open up my screen here, and I'll, accidentally close Zoom again. So where I left off yesterday, I think we had just created the save feature. And then I wanted to show you all one thing that I added after I realized that I was not on the screen anymore, was that we want our users. So if I were to create a new user here, so let's say user.new, and then I'm going to pass it in a hash of a name with the key of name, Chris, and an email, chris@gmail. I have a new user, and I've set such that the ID is set to nil when I've created an instance of something, right? When I've made a new instance. This means that this hasn't been persisted to the database yet. It's not persisted to the database until I actually call save. Save runs the SQL code to insert this into the row, right? Or to insert it into the user's table as a row. So I'm going to say user.save. And if I call back on user again, I see that the user instance that I created now has an ID of 1. Now I updated this save method to let's say, for example, that I want to change my email address, right? User.email, and I'll say it's actually chris@flatironschool.com. And if I go look at the user instance now, I see that the email has changed. I think one other thing that I didn't do yesterday with you is I created this all method. So if I type in user.all, I should get an array of all of these user objects, right? So if I call user.all, I'm running the SQL query to get all of the users, and then I'm iterating over each row and creating a, oh, one second. This is a lot. It's okay, I'll get it later. Why is it? Anyways, weird, my door wasn't locked all night. That's funny. Right, so it's pulling from the database and creating all and making new instances of all of the users. So when I run user.all, I see that with the user with the ID of 1, or the first row in the database, it still has chris@gmail.com, my old email address on there. But I want to update it such that it has this new email address. So I know that this is still in user, right? My user instance. So I can call save on this again. I should be able to call save on this again. And now when I go to user.all, I see that I still only have one user in my database. The user with the ID of 1 now has an updated email address. So I wrote this line of code here that says, if an instance has an ID, and if I run this execute method to see if the database can confirm this, then I want to use this update SQL query, or this SQL command, to ultimately change what information that row has. So that's one kind of important thing that I wanted you to distinguish. The other second thing that I really wanted to distinguish with you is that we notice in this self.all command, this class method all, I'm iterating over all of the rows, and in every row I'm making a new user instance. If I call user.all, if we look at the 3 times that I've called it, the instance that Ruby has created to reflect the row in the database has a different code that explains, or that references where it's stored in memory, right? This one ends in 8E8, this one ends in D30, 3630. And if you remember at the beginning of the lecture yesterday, I wanted to communicate that this code that represents where this specific Ruby instance is stored in memory is no longer the important bit of information here. The bit of information that's important is the key, right? Or sorry, the ID, the primary ID. This gets a little tricky, right? And it's both tricky and simple at the same time. I think as an instructor trying to explain it, I might be overemphasizing this a little bit. I think that as you work with this more, it'll become more natural. But the thing that I really want to kind of demonstrate here is that, let's say, for example, I say like, here's my first grab of user.all, and here's my second grab of user.all, right? If I go into my first grab of user.all, I say user from first grab, and I say first grab, of course, there's only one user here, so first grab dot 0, and then I say user from second grab, and I say second grab dot 0. I essentially have two user instances that both reference the same user, although their IDs here are different, right? The Ruby active memory code is different. But if I take the user from the first grab and I change the name, for example, to like Cristo, and I call .save on this, this is going to run, right? The name has changed. And similarly, if I take the second user instance and I change the email, superchris, oops, user from second grab.save, this has also changed. So it's important to remember that many kind of Ruby instances that we have alive at any given moment can ultimately affect what's on the database if we call .save on them, because the way that I've written my method, really the only thing that we're checking for is what the ID is. So it's important to remember, and again, I think as you kind of move on in the curriculum, Jen and I talked about this yesterday, you won't even really think about this anymore. But as we transition from having these really specific Ruby instances be kind of our source of truth of where we're actually making changes, it's important to kind of note that we're not making changes here anymore. The Ruby instances are just, again, animating what we have in the database, and what we call save on it, the only thing that our method is really checking is, oh, well, what's the ID for this instance? Because whatever the ID is here is ultimately where it's going to go change in the database. So those are just the two final things that I wanted to go over yesterday. One of them being our save method should be able to save a new instance that hasn't been saved to the database, or update an instance if it already has an ID. And the self.all method just is recalling the database over and over again. And it's okay to make new user instances, because calling new by itself doesn't save anything to the database, right? It's just making a Ruby instance. So this differentiation between creating a Ruby instance isn't the same thing as saving anything to the database. Does that make sense? Are there any questions about that? Anything I can clarify?
Actually, quick question.
Sure.
Now, one thing I would like to confirm. So usually inside of the table, right, we have a unique identifier, which is the ID, right? The primary ID. All right. So now if we have this unique identifier, there's, again, if that was somehow removed, there's no other number that would actually replicate that number that was removed, right?
Exactly.
The only one that's in the table. So if that's the case, can we also, in the .save method, can we say self.id?
What do you mean?
Instead of saying, okay, so for example, I'm seeing on line 16, we have self.id, and then we have, we're also checking the row,
right,
to see where it has that same ID, and we're checking the array.
Right.
Can we also just say self.id instead? So that way it says, okay, do you have an ID? And it says, no, I do not have an ID, meaning that it never got saved into the database in the first place.
Well, what if I said,
Good stuff.
What
Okay.
what if I said this? I just I just forced Jen to be saved into the database, right? Or I just forcibly gave Jen an ID when I know that if I call user.all, Jen isn't there, right? She's not in my database. But I went in and I kind of did a hack and I gave her an ID. I can give her, you know, any ID that I want, right?
Okay.
But if I call save, that
Oh,
method
wow.
that method's gonna say, this isn't gonna run because I'm checking, I'm saying, hey, is there actually a user with an ID of 23 in the database? And this method's gonna say no. So whoever put the ID there lied about it, right? So let's go ahead and make a new one. And if I go to user at all, Jen has an ID of 2.
Nice.
You see what I'm saying? So that's why I built it that way. Because you're right, we could just say self.id, but I just added a second layer of security there, I guess. Again, there are lots of ways in which we could mishandle information, right? And we don't really have time to build all of the security measures for that, but we're going to be working with an ORM in the future that's going to handle all of that. Well, it's going to have more built-in security for us.
I just have a quick question, because I think in the Learn labs, they do this a different way, and I want to make sure it's actually equivalent.
Sure.
Because I think in the Learn, they only give the ID a reader and not a writer, and then they only check for self.id. Is that basically equivalent to what you did here?
Well,
Just a different way of protecting it?
Different than what I'm doing because that, how could I, if I only had a reader, right? I mean, I'd have to look at the lab. I'm sure that it has a way of doing it. The purpose, the thing that I'm trying to avoid is I want to be able to say user.new and then just pass in a name of Lucy, right? When I create a new user, I shouldn't have an ID right away.
Yes. It assigns the ID to nil, and then it just lets SQL assign it, I think. So you can't.
Sure, I guess you can say like at, you can say sure at ID. You can do
I
this.
think that's what they did, something like that.
Yeah, I mean you can do that too. Yeah, that's true. I guess you could just have a reader for that. That's, yeah, I mean somebody did that yesterday. I think Mithelbert maybe had said that yesterday. But yeah, I mean, I guess I kind of went an extra route and I did this as kind of my, yeah, that works. Yeah, that's fine.
They both look like they would definitely work, so no.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's fine. As long as a method is being able to change the ID, then that works. Mm-hmm. Sweet. Any other questions? All right, so Jen and I are going to Slack out the repository to this, but just to kind of go over really quickly what the instructions are. We're gonna have you create a new tweet RB file, and then we're gonna ask you to require that environment file here. And then we want you to build out these methods. A lot of these initial methods are gonna be very similar to what we've already built out in the user class, but we're gonna ask you to try to build these out on your own without looking at the user class, right? The setup table, the initialize, and the save are all going to be very similar, as well as the all, but try to build them out on your own and only use the user model as a reference if you're really stuck. And then once you're done building up the tweet class, we have 2 new methods that we want you to go back to the user class to try to make. Again, it's okay if you don't get done with all of this. You just want to see how far you go. And then if you want to continue pairing on this with somebody else, that'd be awesome. And then we just have some guidelines for you to run the console. Again, the way that I ran the console here was just ruby console.rb. See if you should be able to run this code in your console, and it should work. And then if you get done early, you can raise your hand in the Zoom room.